Hello everyone and welcome to my presentation. Today I will be discussing the lack of fiber in the average American diet, why it is harmful, and the simple fix to aid in reversing this damage. The typical Western diet has long been characterized as being rich in added sugars, trans fats, and saturated fats, as well as being overall deficient in nutritional value. In fact, in a 2019 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, they found that more than 42% of our average intake is derived from low-quality carbohydrates, also known as simple carbohydrates. In addition, more than 10% of our average intake was from saturated fats alone. So, when we think of the term average American diet, you might typically think of fast foods like pizza, burgers, donuts, foods that we typically associate with being unhealthy. But actually, the average American diet doesn't necessarily look like this. And while the foods may look, quote, healthy, they can be just as non-nutritive and deceiving. Here we have an excerpt from a study published in Cell in 2021 by the Sonnenberg Lab called "The Gut Microbiota Targeted Diets Modulate Human Immune Status." This was the typical diet of one participant, and you'll notice that not all of the food looks bad. For example, we see that this individual started their day with a banana and a Larabar. However, this Larabar is the first example of a non-nutrient dense American diet staple. While the Larabar might seem like a healthy choice on its own, after all, it says real ingredients on the front, if you flip it over to investigate the nutrient contents, it actually lacks any real nutritive content and is high in added sugars, specifically cane sugar. This corresponds directly to the high sugar consumption typically associated with the American diet. The next item on the list that we'll briefly look at is the Amy's Frozen Thai Red Curry. It sounds and looks kind of healthy, right? It seems to have jasmine rice, a good source of complex carbohydrates, and vegetables. However, once again, when you flip over to look at the nutritional content, you'll see that there is little nutritional value and a high concentration of saturated fats. Nearly half the recommended value for a day is only in one meal. Overall, all of this is to demonstrate that even with healthy-looking food, they still follow the definition of an average American or Western diet, which is high in simple carbs and sugars, high in saturated fats, and low overall in nutrients. So I've mentioned the terms simple and complex carbohydrates, but what exactly are they? The difference between a simple and complex carb is in how quickly it is digested and absorbed, as well as its chemical structure. Most carbohydrates can be broken down by digestion into glucose. So on the left, we have our simple carbohydrates, which are also called simple sugars. These sugars are found in a variety of natural food sources, including fruit, vegetables, and milk, and they give food that characteristic sweet taste. But they also raise blood glucose levels quickly. So these sugars can be characterized as single sugars, monosaccharides, double sugars, disaccharides, or polysaccharides, which are not simple sugars. Monosaccharides typically include glucose, your fructose, which is found in fruit, or galactose, which is found in your dairy products. Your complex carbohydrates on the right are also known as the polysaccharides and are starches formed by the longer saccharide chains, which means that they will take longer to break down. Typically, at a chemical level, they comprise of 3 or more linked sugars. So strictly speaking, the term complex carbohydrate refers to any starch, which can include the highly refined starches that we find in white bread, pastries, cakes, and other food sources. So when doctors and dietitians advise having complex carbohydrates, they're usually referring to whole grain foods and starchy vegetables, which are more slowly absorbed than refined carbohydrates. These are also known as whole grain foods. So these whole grain foods or starches include the wheat grain and kernel, which provide the majority of fiber and nutrients found in starchy foods. So these will usually include rice, bread, or any other products made from flour or deriving from a whole grain. And, as mentioned, the Western diet retrieves most of its calories from simple carbohydrates versus complex ones, and, as a result, lacks a lot of the fiber that comes with complex carbs. So, corresponding with the lack of nutritive food choices and complex carbs in the American diet are a lack of foods with high or moderate amounts of fiber. Actually, only 5% of the population meets the recommendation of fiber consumption, according to national consumption surveys. In addition, women should try to eat at least 21 to 25 grams of fiber a day, while men should aim for around 30 to 38. When these levels are not reached, this can present problems for regulation of digestion and bowel movements, but at the gut microbiome level, there is even a more concerning process occurring. Our gut microbiome is essentially the living ecosystem of bacteria inside our stomach, small and large intestines. It is intricately involved with the regulation of our metabolism, it aids in our immune system function, and there is emerging research linking it to central nervous system disorders, including neurodegenerative diseases and even autism. In addition, most of the actual gut microbiome refers to the ecosystem residing inside the colon, where there is the greatest total abundance of bacteria. So when we compare the breakdown of simple versus complex carbohydrates, we see that simple carbs are readily broken down in the small intestine and will not reach the gut bacteria inside the colon. However, complex carbs reach the colon mostly undigested because they are harder to digest, and humans are generally bad at digesting complex carbs. So we have a mutualistic relationship with the bacteria inside our gut that help us digest these carbs. In return, the bacteria themselves receive nutrition. So, if these complex carbs help feed the bacteria, what happens when someone following the average American diet does not get adequate amounts of fiber and complex carbs? So these are images from a study done by Earl et al., published in Cell in 2015, where mice were fed a fiber-rich diet were compared with those fed primarily simple sugars and overall lacking in fiber. The two images here represent cross-sections of a colon in the two mice, one following the fiber-rich diet and one lacking fiber. The blue staining represents the large intestine epithelium, while the red on the right represents the colonic bacteria. The green represents the mucus lining on the top of the bacteria, and the yellow represents fibrous debris from the food of the mice. If you look at the two images, the green mucus band is much thicker in the fiber-rich diet. This is significant because it suggests that with a lack of fiber and complex carbohydrates in the mice following the fiber-deficient diet, the bacteria residing in the colon are actually starving and begin to use that mucus lining as a food source because that mucus lining is also rich in carbohydrates. Thus, without the protective lining of fiber derived from fiber-rich foods inside the colon, the bacteria themselves are essentially eating the host out from the inside. The good news is that, according to the same Sonnenberg et al. Study mentioned previously, that this damage inside the colon can be reversed. This would involve simply increasing fiber consumption to at least the recommended levels, which, as mentioned previously, for women should be between 21 and 25 grams of fiber a day, while men should aim for between 30 to 38 grams a day. Foods high in fiber would include the complex carbs mentioned, like oats, barley, and rice, but fiber could also be obtained from better sources of simple carbs as well, such as fruits and vegetables instead of processed foods with simple sugars. These fruits and vegetables also contain the fiber, which would remain intact through the small intestine. So, the overall take-home message from this presentation is don't let bacteria eat you alive, and to just eat more fiber.